So welcome everybody. It's good to see you. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today. Uh, Continuing to read Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil by Hannah Arendt. So we have gotten through the middle 5 chapters, or the 5 lost chapters that I often call them, because I don't think most people read them. The very sort of dry, or thought to be dry, factual chapters about the actual deportations. But I hope our reading of them showed you that they're actually pretty fascinating chapters, and very much worth our time and attention. Again, the sort of premise of these chapters that we just finished is that Arendt argues that the Holocaust happened very differently in almost every different country, and by paying attention to how it happened, or in some cases, as in Denmark or Bulgaria, how it didn't happen, you see the consequences of to what extent it matters whether people obey or don't obey. In Denmark and Bulgaria, where the people just simply resisted and said no to the Nazis, almost no Jews were killed. And that's a lesson that I think is central to her book, and to her understanding of politics, and her understanding of political action, her understanding of political courage. Um, and I think it's something that is very much worth attending to. That lesson, that it does matter how people who are asked to participate in evil respond, is going to come back at the end of this chapter, right? And in some of, I think, maybe the most powerfully morally charged language of all of Arendt's writing, at the end of this chapter. And so we'll get there, and it will return us to this same dynamic of how it matters the way we respond to orders, or to movements that ask us to do um, evil things. In any case, the chapter we're reading today is chapter 15. I'm sorry, chapter 14, on evidence and witnesses. Um, uh, it starts somewhat dryly again, where she's sort of rehearsing um, the different forms of evidence and witnesses that were at the trial. And so remember that Arendt likes to present this as a report, right? Her original title was, was simply Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report. She added later a report on the banality of evil. But she really wants to argue that this is a factual report, and there's over the course of the book, I think you've seen her attempt to be very, step by step factual, and there are times, I think, when she deviates from that. She wants to say she didn't, but there are a few, and we've encountered those. So, but she begins with this very factual recounting that first there's documentary evidence, right? All the documents that prove what the Nazis did. And even though Eichmann's bureau burned everything very efficiently, other bureaus did not. And as a result, we're able to tell the story through documentary evidence of the Holocaust. That story, that basic story, is confirmed by witnesses from other trials in Nuremberg and others. And while normally evidence from other trials would not be allowed in a legal trial because it would be considered hearsay evidence, the Israeli law under which Eichmann is tried allows for such testimony to be used, and therefore it was legal. The third is there were not many defense witnesses, and the reason is that they were blocked from coming to Israel by fear of prosecution in Israel, because most of the defense witnesses people who actually would know what Eichmann had done and would know maybe that he didn't do this or he did that, were Nazis and would not come to Israel. And she says that this does refute in some ways Israel's claim that Jerusalem was the best place for the trial because it was where all the witnesses and documents were held. She says, first of all, it was not where the witnesses for the defense were. And secondly, it's actually not where most of the documents were held. It's also important to remember, though, that she does in the opening chapter defend the choice of holding the trial in Israel. So it's not that she's against it. She's just saying that this particular argument doesn't work. There is an interesting point she makes at the bottom of page 221, where she says that the defense here, as also the defense in Nuremberg, was underfunded and did not have the kind of staff to go through the hundreds of thousands of pages of documents that were in archives around Europe and could have helped make the case. And so that the result is that, to the extent, even 18 years after the end of the war, to the extent that we know a documentary history of the Nazi period, our knowledge of that is almost exclusively through the selection of the documents made by prosecutors, first in Nuremberg, then in other trials, then in Israel, because it was the prosecutors, the victors, who had the money to hire teams and teams of investigators to go through these archives and tell their story. So at the bottom of 221, she says, even today, 18 years after the war, our knowledge of the immense archival material of the Nazi regime rests to a large extent on the selection made for purposes of prosecution. It's an important point that, much of the way we understand the documentary history comes from the fact that most of the people who've gone through the documents have done so with the aim of prosecution. The fourth kind of testimony is Eichmann's testimony himself. And Arendt says that this was the most important evidence in the case. From her point of view, this was the core of the case. Eichmann was on the stand for 14 days, interviewed by his defense counsel, Dr. Servatius. He was then cross-examined for 17 days by the prosecution, and he was then questioned for 2 days by the judges. And Arendt says that in those 2 days, the judges got more out of him in 2 short sessions than the prosecution had been able to elicit in 17. This is a theme we've encountered before. She really does respect the judges, and she really doesn't respect Mr. Hausner. Just a quick note. Arendt was at the beginning of the trial, right? When it started on April 11th. She then left for a bit on May 5th. And then she came back on June 20th for Eichmann's testimony. And she stayed for about 20 days then. So she did see all of Eichmann's testimony, and she did see much of the testimony by the fifth category of evidence that she then brings up, which is the prosecution witnesses. So we had the documentary evidence, we had the defense witnesses, we have other witnesses from other trials, we have Eichmann's testimony, and now here she's going to talk about the prosecution witnesses. And this is where she spends the most of her time in this chapter. Eichmann, she says, was on the stand for 33 and a half sessions. The prosecution witnesses were there for almost double that, 62 sessions. 100 witnesses over 62 sessions. Most of these prosecution witnesses, she says, were picked from hundreds and hundreds of applications. Think about what happened here. People applied to speak at the trial. It's like those of you who are academics, right? People sent in abstracts to try and speak at the conference. They wanted to speak. They wanted to tell their story. And the prosecution chose 100 of them to do so. 90 of the ones they chose were survivors of some sort. Arendt, doesn't think much of this process. She says it would have been wiser to pick the witnesses who had not volunteered, right? She thinks that these people who volunteered too often volunteered with ulterior motives. Some of them volunteered because they were authors and they wanted to promote their books. Some of them volunteered because they just wanted to hear themselves speak. They thought they were important. And she's not a fan of a lot of this testimony. One particular was a man who had renamed himself Kazetnik, as the name for a inmate. And he's someone who's written a number of books on Auschwitz. And she says he sought to tell his story, the same story that he told at all his public appearances about his name, his belief in astrology, the stars and their influence on Auschwitz, and things like that. And when he was interrupted and asked to answer particular questions, he got upset and he fainted and didn't answer any more questions. And she says this was an exception, but the rule was that most of the witnesses who spoke for the prosecution didn't know how to tell a story, and didn't present any kind of effective story or evidence. There were, however, some exceptions, right? And she begins to address these on pages 226 and 227. And the next 6 or 7 pages from 226 until 233, the end of this chapter, are, I think, some of the more powerful pages in this book. She says that Judge Landau, the head judge, had tried valiantly at times to restrain Mr. Hausner in his efforts to have these witnesses just go on and paint a picture of what had happened. And he largely failed, and people just went on and on. And she says normally it was pretty boring, but on 227, she says, every once in a long while, one was glad that Judge Landau had lost his battle. And the first such moment occurred even before the battle had started. So every once in a while, you were glad that Landau lost his battle and Hausner just let these witnesses tell their story. There are a couple of stories that she emphasizes as meaningful. One was someone named Hota Yeshai, Mr. Hota Yeshai, who she says told a simple truth, that those who survived the ghettos and the camps, who had come out alive from the nightmare of absolute helplessness and abandonment, as though the whole world was a jungle and they its prey, had only one wish, to go where they would never see a non-Jew again. They needed the emissaries of the Jewish people of Palestine in order to learn that they could come legally or illegally, by hook or by crook, and that they would be welcome. So, just listening to Mr. Hota Yeshai, she says, one saw and one felt the deep need of the rescued inmates from the camps, the Jews in the camps, to just get out of Europe and go to a place where they could be amongst Jews. And she found that quite moving. The next story is the story of Zindel Grinspan. Um, Zinder Grinspan is the father of Herschel Grinspan. Herschel Grinspan is someone who's a minor historical figure insofar as on November 7th, 1938, he walked up to the German embassy in Paris and shot to death Ernst von Raeth, the Legionsrat in Paris, and in doing so, triggered the pogroms in Germany on Kristallnacht, or November 9th, 2 days later. Um, and so Herschel Grinspan is the person who um, uh, was used as an excuse by the Nazis in Germany for Kristallnacht. Why Herschel Grinspan assassinated Ernst von Rath is unclear. Ernst von Rath was actually a fairly uh, strong critic of the Nazis. He was, even though he was a German Legionsrat, and had been fairly supportive of the Jews. There's some speculation that it had to do with an affair of sorts. They were both apparently gay. But it's also the case that 1 month before this happened, Herschel Grinspan's father, uh, um, uh, Zindel Grinspan, who had been living in Germany for 11 years, I'm sorry, for 27 years, since 1911, was rounded up along with many other Polish Jews who still had Polish nationality in Germany, and brought to the police station, roughed up, told to sign papers that gave up all their possessions, put on buses, put on trains, beat up, whipped, hit, forced to march across the border, brought to a town where, not having eaten in 2 days, there was no food and no housing for them, and stuck out in the driving rain where people were fainting. And in this horrendous situation, Zindel Grinspan writes to his son Herschel in Paris and says, "Don't write any more letters in Germany. We are now in Zebasen in Poland." And Arendt sums up her thoughts about Zindel Grinspan's testimony in this way. She writes on page 229 to 230. This story took no more than perhaps 10 minutes to tell. And when it was over, the senseless, needless destruction of 27 years in less than 24 hours, one thought foolishly, everyone should have his day in court. Right? She found this testimony of Zindel Grinspan deeply moving. And it made you think that there's a sense to let everybody come to court and tell their story. I mentioned last session that, Deborah Lipstadt has written a really nice book on the Eichmann trial. And there's a chapter on Arendt in which she says, what Arendt got wrong is that the trial was not about doing justice to Adolf Eichmann. It was about telling the stories of the Holocaust. And Arendt says, actually, there's some truth to that here. Everyone should have their day in court, and we should let everybody tell their story. But then she continues, only to find out in the endless sessions that followed how difficult it was to tell the story. That, at least outside the transforming realm of poetry, it needed a purity of soul, an unmirrored, unreflected innocence of heart and mind that only the righteous possess. And so what she's basically saying is, yeah, Zindel Grinspan told his story in a way that was moving and meaningful, tragic, heartrending, honest. But of the 100 people who testified, very few had that impact or power. One other story that she mentions is the story of Anton Schmidt, who was a sergeant in the German army. And his job at that time in the area of Poland was to move around the front lines and find lost German soldiers and bring them back to their units. And in some of his wanderings, he found a Jewish underground resistance group that included Abba Kovner in it. And Abba Kovner tells this story about Anton Schmidt at the trial, that Anton Schmidt not only helped the Jewish resistance by giving them false papers and trucks and other supplies, but most shockingly, because that was done at times, but most shockingly, he did it for no money. He did it for nothing. And then after 5 months, he was discovered and executed. And this is what Arendt says about Kovner's rendition of the story of Anton Schmidt. During the few minutes it took Kovner to tell of the help that had come from a German sergeant, a hush settled over the courtroom. And it was as though the crowd had spontaneously decided to observe the usual 2 minutes of silence in honor of the man named Anton Schmidt. And in those 2 minutes, which were like a sudden burst of light in the midst of impenetrable, unfathomable darkness, a single thought stood out clearly, irrefutably beyond question. How utterly different everything would be today in this courtroom in Israel, in Germany, in all of Europe, and perhaps in all countries of the world, if only more such stories could have been told. If only more such stories like that of Anton Schmidt, if more German sergeants or German people had helped the Jewish people without asking for money, how the world would have changed, right? Again, going back to, if only more leaders in Europe had been like the King of Denmark, who said, if they're going to wear a yellow star, it'll be me first. And Arendt then says, why were there so few people like Anton Schmidt? And she says, there's one hint in a book, one of the few earnest memoirs by Germans after the war. Peter Baum, who wrote a book called Die Unsichtbare Flagge, the Invisible Flags. And she quotes from Peter Baum on page 232, and she writes, and Peter Baum writes, we knew this. We knew about the killings. We did nothing. Anyone who had seriously protested or done anything against the killing unit would have been arrested within 24 hours and would have disappeared. It belongs among the refinements of totalitarian governments in our century that they don't permit their opponents to die a great, dramatic, martyr's death for their convictions. A good many of us might have accepted such a death. The totalitarian state lets its opponents disappear in silent anonymity. It is certain that anyone who had dared to suffer death rather than silently tolerate that crime would have sacrificed his life in vain. So this is the argument that Arendt here amplifies as to why fewer people, why there weren't more people like Anton Schmidt. It's not just that people would have been killed. It's that they would have been killed in vain, that they would have been disappeared, and they wouldn't even become martyrs or be remembered. And by the way, this to some degree mirrors a kind of argument that Arendt makes in The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she talks about concentration camps as being holes of oblivion, where people would disappear and you wouldn't even know if your loved ones or your friends were in them or what happened to them. They just disappeared. And that oblivion, that disappearance, she thinks of as one of the true markers of totalitarianism. And here she's bringing that up again, and Peter Baum is bringing it up as well. But Arendt has changed her mind here. There's people always, it's well known that she says, I changed my mind about the banality of evil, about the quality of evil from between Origins of Totalitarianism and Eichmann. But here's another case where she's changed her mind. She says that the fatal flaw in Baum's argument is Anton Schmidt. What Anton Schmidt proves, and the fact that we today know about Anton Schmidt and what he did, is that, and this is the line, maybe one of my favorite lines in all of Arendt's work, but it's here on page 232 to 233. The holes of oblivion do not exist. Just keep repeating that line to yourself. The holes of oblivion do not exist. Nothing human is that perfect. And there are simply too many people in the world to make oblivion possible. One man will always be left alive to tell the story. That is, if you want to see where the hope is in Arendt's book and in her thinking, that's it. Natality is this idea that there's always going to be a new beginning. And the fact that there is no holes of oblivion is the fact that there will always be one man left to tell the story. There will always be someone left. And she says the lesson of such stories that will always be told is simple and within everybody's grasp. Politically speaking, so the lesson, politically speaking, is that under conditions of terror, most people will comply, but some people will not. Just as the lesson of the countries to which the final solution was proposed is that it could happen in most places, but it did not happen everywhere, right? Just like in most countries, the population complied and the Holocaust happened. It didn't happen in Denmark and it didn't happen in Bulgaria. Humanly speaking, Arendt writes, no more is required and no more can reasonably be asked for this planet to remain a place fit for human habitation. What do we need to do to keep our humanity alive? This is a question she raised in The Human Condition. As more automation happens, as science begins to determine our world, as artificial intelligence emerges and we become, more and more dots of information guided through superhumanly intelligent matrices, right? How do we keep our humanity? How do we keep our human nature alive? And no more is required than the fact that we remember that the holes of oblivion do not exist. There will always be someone alive to tell the story. There will always be someone who acts freely. There will always be someone who gums up the gears of the machine or the AI or the bureaucratic system. And as bad as things get, and they have gotten pretty bad in the history, and they may get pretty bad again pretty soon, humanly speaking, all we can ask is that the holes of oblivion do not exist. To me, that's one of the more beautiful and poignant reflections in all of Arendt's work. And I will stop there and look forward to our discussion. As usual, you can enter the discussion in the chat. Please be respectful and follow our general rule, which is that you can disagree, but do not attack the person. And you can also raise your hand by going down to the reaction button, clicking raise hand, and I will recognize you. Look forward to the discussion. Steven, nice to see you.
Hi, Roger. Nice to see you. I'd like to talk a little bit about Herschel Greenspan, who you just mentioned was a minor historical figure. So Arendt writes on page 227, Herschel Greenspan was a psychopath, unable to finish school, who for years had knocked about Paris and Brussels, being expelled from both places. This sentence, according to the historical record, is incorrect. He was never diagnosed as a psychopath, and he wasn't expelled from either Paris or Brussels. I'll give you the sources in a second. After the Nuremberg laws of 1935, Greenspan left primary school at the age of 14 due to persecution from his teacher and fellow students. He was a religious shy boy, and his community raised funds to send him to a yeshiva for 1 year. With no future in Germany, he was to go to Paris to live with poor relatives. Though born in Germany, he was denied citizenship, as both his parents were Polish. He was able to get a Polish passport and a German exit visa. He could travel through Belgium, but couldn't legally enter France as he could not show financial support. Jews were not allowed to take money out of Germany. He entered France illegally. He was not expelled from Belgium. He stayed in France until he was extradited by the Germans for assassinating the Nazi von Rath. Greenspan considered himself a hero, a Jew who fought back, avenging the treatment of his family and community. At the time of the assassination, he insisted on a Jewish avenger defense, like that of Sholem Schwarzbard, who was acquitted in 1927. There was no doubt of his motivation, as in Greenspan's pocket, there was a note to his family, quote, "With God's help, my dear parents, I cannot do otherwise. May God forgive me. The heart bleeds when I hear of your tragedy and that of the 12,000 Jews. I must protest so that the whole world hears my protest, and that I will do. Forgive me," unquote. I think it was utterly unfair of Arendt to have called Greenspan a psychopath. Those interested in his story, those on this call, can find a lengthy Wikipedia entry with 50 citations, and as well as a 400-page book published in 2014 on Greenspan by the historian Jonathan Kirsch. I also would point out that with regard to his motivation to avenge his family's treatment, the arrest and expulsion of Polish Jews from Germany happened October 29th. Greenspan's assassination of the low-level functionary at the embassy was November 7th. And Kristallnacht actually officially was 9th and 10th, but there were anti-Jewish riots that started on the evening of November 7th in response to the assassination.
Thank you. You know, I know nothing of Herschel Greenspan outside of what I've read in the book. You know, I'm sure, you know, and I have no reason to doubt Wikipedia, although not sure that's a statement I'm willing to stand by. But you know, I don't doubt that. I don't know what Arendt's sources are. I don't know what she knew at the time about him. Obviously, she was relying on something, but there's, you know, I don't know what it was. And it's possible there are facts wrong, but I don't know. So it's perfectly worthwhile to pursue that and do the research. So I appreciate it.
Can I also add that overnight, Greenspan became a world celebrity. And Trotsky even wrote a piece for him called For Greenspan Against Fascist Pogrom Gangs and Stalinist
Yeah.
Scoundrels.
You know,
So,
all I'll say is, first of all, Arendt is going to write a lot about Shalom Schwarzbard in the next chapter. Um, and you'll see that she's a huge fan of Shalom Schwarzbard. Um, uh, I'm not I'm not here to cast aspersions on Herschel Greenspan or anything. I just don't know. Um, but I would say that you know the that there is probably um and I think Arendt, the implication of Arendt's book is of her account is that the main reason Greenspan did this was to avenge his parents and have anger out of it. That's the implication of the story here. Um, that there may have been other motives and other things going on, is something that she brings up. My guess is these things came up at the trial. I don't know. And I don't know how to uh to 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 ascertain that. But I think it's good that we know that that it's good that we know that there's a account and an account that she largely agrees with, that this was done in response to the to the horrific story of what happened to his father and his family and his community, and that is the mainstream accepted history. And I don't think Arendt is contesting that. I think there's obviously some other rumors or something going on that she's alluding to. I'm not sure what they are, and I'm not sure it's very important. But I think it's important for us to know the basic facts. So thank you, Hannah.
Yeah, in terms of Greenspan, he was very famous, obviously. He was, it was to him that it was attributed the punishment of Kristallnacht. He was 17 years old when he shot von Rath, and he's in every history of the Holocaust. Um, I was surprised to see that he was labeled a psychopath. Um, but he's in virtually every history of the Holocaust. Now, I have two comments to make, and I'm sure many people have watched this, but last night I was curious to see some of these witnesses that Arendt writes about. So I went to YouTube and I found the trial of Eichmann by Michael Prazan, 1997. You've probably seen it, Roger, and I'm sure many people have, but it's just so amazing to see the actual people that she writes about. And I wanted to discuss a little bit about Kay Zetnick, because, the man who collapsed after talking about being on another planet. Auschwitz was another planet. She sort of has a very dismissive air about attitude towards him. And yet what I discovered was this guy whose real name was Yehiel Denner, but he was born Feiner in 1909, died in 2001, born in Poland, trained at a yeshiva before the Holocaust, and written about by people such as Tom Segev when he died in Haaretz in 2001, and taught in schools in Israel, and is still taught in high schools. He strange guy. He didn't want anybody to know he died. He didn't want to be interviewed, but Tom Segev would talk to him. Tom Segev is a very famous Israeli historian, and he talked to him on the phone. So I would just recommend that people look him up. So strange, but I actually found his comments, especially because I'm familiar with Wiesel's writing or with even Jerzy Kaczynski, who is apparently a fraud. But I found his saying that he was on another planet and all this very, very compelling, because if it wasn't another planet, what the hell was it? It was another planet. So, just for people who are interested, YouTube, go to the trial of Albert Eichmann, by Michael Prazin, 1997, and it's just amazing. And the second thing I'd like to say, I thought I knew a lot about, I do know a lot about the Holocaust, but I really was shocked and upset last night to learn really the extent of the animosity that the Holocaust survivors faced in Israel. Somebody had told me years ago that Ben-Gurion referred at one time to the survivors of cakes of soap. And I said, oh my God, that's so horrible. I don't know how he could have said that, but but it turns out that it was a horrible phenomenon of Israel being a young country, and the people who lived there were pioneers, and they hadn't lived through the Holocaust, and their whole focus was on being strong and etc. And the Holocaust survivors had a horrible time. And to this day, they're not getting the money that's owed them in many cases. There's huge amounts of poverty on the youngest of the survivors, oldest is youngest. So I just thought that was just really interesting, but I just thought I'd throw out these sort of things because I found them interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. I think both what you and Stephen are saying is important, and it's one of the things that I think was fascinating about the trial, and also I think fascinating about Arendt's book and this chapter in particular is the the stories, the telling the stories, and
well, that's why I mentioned it about the treatment of the Holocaust survivors. This was apparently the first time that they could have a voice and not be treated like garbage.
that's right.
In some cases.
Oh, I was going to say that. It's hard for us today sometimes to remember this, but in 1960, when the trial happened, largely the survivor communities around the world had been silent. It is something, to remember. And now they talked, I think, probably amongst themselves, but they didn't talk to their children about it. There was a combination of, we want to move on, or embarrassment. I don't know. There's a whole lot of psychoanalytic, et cetera, about it, but they largely had not told their stories. And the Eichmann trial is seen by many sociologists and Holocaust scholars as sort of the point at which that shifts, at which point the victims of the Holocaust for the first time are given a voice and allowed to speak. And as I mentioned, I've tried to say it a couple of times because I actually really like the book, Deborah Lipstadt's book on the Eichmann trial. This is the point she makes, I think, very powerfully, that that the trial was in large part, they saw the trial as an attempt to educate and tell the story, so that future generations would remember, and this was sort of the opening of the floodgates in telling that story. And that's one way to understand the trial. Reading it from Arendt's book point of view, right? You see the tension in her reading. On the one hand, she has this view that a trial is not supposed to be a show trial or to be about educating the next generation. It's about trying to defend Ida Eichmann. And she says this trial, to the extent it brought 100 witnesses, I didn't go through it, but of the 100 witnesses, only 4 talked about areas in which Eichmann actually had operated, or something like it. It was largely irrelevant to him. And yet it was, and so she was like, what's it doing here? And yet, right? And yet she says, when you heard stories like Zindel Grunspan, and when you heard stories like Abba Kovner about Anton Schmidt, it made sense and you wanted to hear more. The problem, she says, is that she didn't think, right? Most of the stories were that compelling. Now, let's also remember, she was of that generation. She knew a lot of the stories. And I think a lot of people like her were like, what am I doing sitting here having to listen to this stuff? I know this stuff. But it wasn't meant for her. It was meant for other people. And that's the tension in her response to these witnesses. I think there's just, you could have different opinions on the point of the trial and whether that made sense. But I think to her credit, even though she's generally skeptical of this kind of testimony, she does recognize that in certain cases, some of the most memorable and meaningful parts of the trial came about because of this testimony. George. Georgia, you got to unmute. Are you there, George?
I'm there.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Now I can.
Okay. Well, I'm going to it's good to be a pessimist because I can go in a certain direction. I also knew a lot about this stuff because unlike other children, I was around a lot of survivors who told me everything because I was one of them. I was sort of like a 1.5 generation, according to Sue Weiss. And one of the things is that's why I wanted to talk about Kazetnik some more. It's Kazetnik. And I didn't know him, but I knew a lot of Kazetniks. And the thing about them is there were really of three types. One was holy fool, the holy fool kinds, which is, this guy may have been one of those, but they were very complicated and they would tell stories and they would faint sometimes. It was part of the thing. There were the others who were just basically tall storytellers. They used to embellish their stories a good deal. And when they got caught, they would also faint. So it's hard to say. And there were the third type, who were very rare, but sort of were truth tellers. And I just want to contrast one of them with Arendt. And it happens to be one who was in the same concentration camp as Arendt. And about Arendt, and here is something that I read about her recently, and it was by Lindsay Stonebridge, who I know has your stamp of approval, so there'll be nothing bad about this one, who said that no one, according to Arendt, knows from rain better than the person who's stuck outside without an umbrella. This was part of her pariah thing. Who knows companionship and friendship, as well as refugees and camp inmates who only have one another? Who knows the frailty and beauty of the human condition more intimately? Now, that sounds great. Now, here's the Kazetnik that I know, who happened to be a French Jew, who also was in the same internment camp as Arendt, but rather than being sent to America as a VIP, he was sent to Auschwitz. And here's what he wrote. Those who rebelled were crushed on the spot. Next to go were the sentimental ones. Those who were worried about their wives, their elderly parents, their children, whose fate they still did not know. Those people were eaten up by anguish, which sapped their resistance. Next were those who despaired, who saw no way out because they had the will to live. The sole common denominator of the survivors seems to be an inordinate appetite for life and the flexibility of a contortionist. I don't believe in the steadfast hero who endures every trial with his head held high, not in Auschwitz. If such a man exists, I never met him, and it must be hard for them to sleep with that halo. Now, that's another kind of Kasetnik, and they're a little bit different from Arendt because they had a totally different experience. The life that they knew was different from what the life that Arendt knew, although both were so-called quote unquote Holocaust survivors. The one who survived the camp were totally different. And one of the things about this particular Kasetnik that she's making fun of is I'm not sure which one he was. I don't think he was the actual truth teller the way that Paul Steinberg was. By the way, Steinberg wrote his memoir 50 years after the Holocaust because he was trying to answer Primo Levi, who named him in one of his books and said what a bad guy he was. It's a whole different aura that you have from these people. And for instance, this thing about Anton Schmidt. I mean, come on. Out of the 6 million who were killed, she had to pick on a Nazi who was a good Nazi. And the same thing, there were 3 million Polish Jews killed. She should have said something good about one of them, at least. The only one who said something good was a Polish Jew who was in Germany and then was sent back to Poland and complained about it. So, I think she was very, very, very smart. She was very good in many things. She was excellent about the perpetrators. About the victims, she wasn't so good. Thank you.
Thanks, George. I mean, George is, I think, George, Hannah, and Steve have all, made a point, which I think is a valid point and one that many people have made, which is that Arendt was not that this trial was not about Adolf Eichmann. It was about the victims.
Mhm.
And it was a chance for the victims to tell their story. And as I said before, I don't want to just repeat myself, right? Arendt sees the poignancy of that and mentions mentions some of the victims who she was touched by. One is Zindel Grinspan, another is Mr. Hotari, and a third was Abba Kovner and his story of Anton Schmidt. Does that mean that she didn't? I think she thought that for the most part, these stories were not as effective as she had hoped, or as she thought they would like them to have been. Does that mean she didn't understand or care for the victims? We can. That's something I guess everyone will make their own decision on. But that it is an argument that's been made, so it's worth hearing. Dina.
By the way, just one thing, Jerzy Kosinski was considered a fraud by Americans. The refugees knew that he made up the whole thing. It was, it was obvious, and he knew that the Europeans would know. So it was a bit of an Oprah type of a thing.
Who was considered a fraud?
Kosinski. So I think someone said that Kosinski was.
I did,
Yeah.
Hannah. He wrote
Yeah,
the Painted Bird. He wrote the Painted Bird, Jerzy Kosinski.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
This dinner was you could call him a fabulous, but that was a genre actually of Holocaust writing, was
Right.
being a fabulist. Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, there's nothing wrong with fabulism as a mode of writing. Arendt's point is precisely that poetry, it can work. It didn't work in a trial, right? It wasn't well suited to telling a story in the context of giving evidence at a trial, and I think that was her point. Okay.
The final thing I want to say, and this is really not, but some people say, not me, that again, this Kasetnik did this whole thing to get attention, but also Arendt wanted a little bit of attention too, which is when she went into the whole Eichmann thing.
Okay. Thank you. Dina.
Jerome, do you want to go before me? So I just want to tease that out a little more and see whether or not it's not just a difference between a trial, but whether some of this also reflects Arendt's notions about storytelling. We know that storytelling is an important notion for Arendt outside of this work, right? In the human condition, for example, and elsewhere. And so, is it possible that this reflects these qualitative differences that Arendt sort of makes in the types of storytelling? So the Anton Schmidt vignette is important because I think that paragraph ends with the idea that if only more such stories could have been told. And then the comparison to what Judge Landau called, painting the picture, this Hausner style of sort of rounding up one witness after another. What Arendt says on page 224 is actually that the reason that testimony or those stories were not comparable to the story of by Greenspan is that those storytellers recounted things that, quote, that, let alone of the rare capacity for distinguishing between things that had happened to the storyteller more than 16 and sometimes 20 years ago, and what he had read and heard and imagined in the meantime. And I think Greenspan's testimony was so effective for Arendt because it lacked that. It was more immediate. And just to sort of show that up a little, I think in The Human Condition, Arendt has a quote in that passage about storytelling from Isak Dinesen, and an essay on Isak Dinesen is in Arendt's collection of essays that she wrote a preface for, Men in Dark Times. And in that essay on Isak Dinesen, also known as the Baroness Karen Blixen of Denmark, Arendt writes, "It is true that storytelling reveals meaning without committing the error of defining it. That it brings about consent and reconciliation with things as they really are, and that we may even trust it to contain eventually, by implication, that last word which we expect from the day of judgment." And I think that quote and Greenspan's testimony, what Arendt says about Greenspan's storytelling at the trial, is kind of the type of storytelling that I think she thinks more valuable than a sort of repetitive, paint the picture style testimony.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think that's important and right. The stories, the two stories that she highlights by Greenspan and Kovner, I think are both notable for being firsthand accounts of their own experiences that are not attempting to, fill it in with other information about what had happened, and not trying to turn it into a pedagogical narrative. They're just telling their story, and with honesty and simplicity. And that's what Arendt found so moving about Greenspan and Kovner. And I think, in a way, by picking people to give witness who wanted to speak and applied to speak, in a sense, many of the people were people who had sort of arguments to make. And I think she was not interested in their arguments. I think every survivor, and she was one, right, has their own arguments. What she was interested in is raw truth, simple truth, brutal honesty. And the two moments she picked out were the two moments of brutal honesty and raw truth and simplicity that she experienced at the trial. I'm sure there were others. I mean, first of all, I don't think she saw all 100 witnesses. I don't think she watched everything. But you know, she brought those two moments out as exemplary, and I think, as Dina said, this idea of telling the story and a truth without defining it, is what Dinas and Arendt find so powerful about storytelling, of telling the meaning of something without defining it, is what they find so powerful about storytelling. And she found these two stories to do that, and quite powerful. So yes, thank you. Jerry.
Hi, Roger.
Hi, Jerry.
Roger, I think you very rightly emphasized the end, the last few pages of this chapter. It is that there'll be no holes of oblivion. That is a tremendous change. I think really tremendous change in Arendt's thinking. And I'd like to pursue it just a little bit more. Because it seems to me that here there's another thing absent. You have often talked about a lost moral sense. There's no talk about morality in this chapter about Anton Schmidt or King Christian. And to take the high and the low there, sort of socially speaking, the King of Denmark and Anton Schmidt. What did they have in common? Neither one of them talks about Kant. It's only Eichmann in this book that talks about Kant. What are we getting into what does this really mean? Why will there be no more holes of oblivion? What did she really mean about why can't there be holes of oblivion? Why she's really talking about a total, it seems to me as a question that I'll end with, is she talking about the totalitarian governments of Nazi Germany, primarily, and Bolshevik Russia, secondarily? Or is she talking about something else here? It's all, I mean, if there are no more holes of oblivion possible,
yeah.
I mean, it seems to me she is talking about something else.
Thank you, Jerry. I mean, I think you've asked two incredibly difficult questions, but they're two of my favorite questions, right? One is, what is it that unites people like Anton Schmidt and the King of Denmark? What is it that allows, requires, motivates some people to resist, whereas others don't? Why is it that some people obey and others don't? Right? I mean, that's the question that she frames. And I've been so struck by this question over the years that about 15 years ago, we started a program at Bard called the Courage to Be program, right? Which is been going on every year for 15 years, where we bring people to speak about this question. What is it that makes people act courageously? What is it that makes people resist? And I think there's, over the years we've had some fascinating discussions and accounts of that. Your friend Jerry and mine, Wolfgang Hoyer, has written a book on courageous handling, courageous action, in which he argues that there's a certain way in which the people who act courageously have something they believe in, whether it's a religious belief or some other non-political belief that that gives them a sense of who they are, such that they can't do certain things. And there are other arguments that people have made, but why? There's a very beautiful book by A.L. Perez called Beautiful Souls, which looks at four people in the late 20th, early 21st century, all of whom risked their lives to do the right thing. And A.L. Perez sort of uses Arendt and tries to look at what is it about these four people that makes them act courageously, or allows them to act courageously. And I think for Arendt, in the end, it simply comes down to a matter of what she would sometimes call character, or thinking, and not being able to live with yourself if you don't act this way. There are people who have character, and for those people to participate in the kind of killing that Peter Baum participated in is just not something they can do. There's not an argument. Arguments are not relevant here. But I think examples are. And that's why, in the Courage to Be program, a lot of what we do is provide examples of people who act courageously, with the idea that the hope being that some students will be so struck by some of these examples of courageous action that they will feel the need to do so as well. And if the need were to assert itself. So I don't know if I can be better than that. I don't think you're going to argue yourself into courageous action, but I think there are people who just need to do it.
Examples of the go-kart of judgment, and I think there you are onto something. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, the other thing, the other part of your question is the holes of oblivion question, and and you and I agree. I'm glad to see that this was a major shift in Arendt's thinking, and B, deeply important. You asked sort of, why are there no holes of oblivion? And I think the answer comes down to a combination of plurality and natality. There are no holes of oblivion because there's just so many people. Someone will tell the story. And I think Arendt, is sitting here listening to the trial and is struck by the fact that the stories are being told, and that as bad as the Holocaust was and as awful as the camps were, some people survived the camps and they have told their stories. And I think that's deeply moving to her. And I think that's where she changed her mind on this question. So that's all I can say. But the first time I don't know if not the first time I read it, but the first time I taught this book, after having taught many years the origins of totalitarianism, when I came across this line that the holes of oblivion do not exist, it hit me like one of those, tons of bricks dropping on you. I mean, it really did. It's one of those lines of Arendt's where you see her changing something that she believed, and her seeing something important. And I think it's an extraordinarily important and beautiful phrase, the way she struck it. It's interesting, when Arendt wrote this, she wanted the book was going to be it was obviously translated to German, but originally she wanted oh, I'm blanking on the name, a German writer who she was very fond of, to translate it. And the writer refused or did not, for whatever reasons. But RN said, look, this is not a book that can be just translated dryly. It has to be, it's the words have power. And I think this is one of those lines that I don't know how it's translated eventually in German, but it needs to be done correctly. So, Stephen Greenleaf.
Thanks, Roger. I'm very impressed with what Arendt has done here because she has traveled down two adjoining but separate tracks at the same time. She's very good and very sensitive to the legal issues involved in a criminal trial, talking about problems of hearsay, relevance of evidence, evidence that, for instance, an American court might be called prejudicial because it shows outside bad acts, not directly involved in the crime for which the person is accused. And at the same time, she's acting as a historian and recounting these stories and telling us the value of these stories. And she is implicitly recognizing the difference between law and history, because in law, judgments are final at some point. And once, especially a criminal case has been litigated to its completion, that judgment can't be changed, absent some very extraordinary and unusual circumstances. But at some point, it becomes final. But history's judgment is never final and is always subject to revision. And I mean, we see this, we see it at play here today in the things that Stephen and Hannah said about Grinsbaum and judgments that she made about him that appear maybe factually incorrect. And as you just pointed out, we see it in her own change of mind about her judgments as to what occurred. And I think this is an important distinction to keep in mind. And so I'm sympathetic that she has these complaints about procedurally about what happened. And I think later efforts since the Holocaust, since this time, are better handled by truth and reconciliation commissions, historical inquiries, documentary filmmakers, and the like. The stories must be told, but they must be told in the appropriate way, the most effective way, as Dina indicates, and in a way that doesn't prejudice the legal system, which has to maintain its own integrity.
I think that's really well said, Stephen. Thank you. I mean, yeah, she's working on multiple levels here, right? The legal level, right? The historical level, the storytelling level, and then the what to take from this, the lessons level, not morals as in morality, but the morale, or the moral of the story. And that's a story. I mean, I think it's important to keep this in mind. I mean, at this point, we're nearing the end of the book. One of the core morals of this story, right, is that it matters how individuals react, right? It matters what Schmidt did. It matters what Grinspan did. It mattered what the King of Denmark did and what the people in Bulgaria did. It also mattered what the Nazis who worked, the intellectual Nazis like Ernst von Roth did, right? I mean, one of the interesting things that she, brings up here is Ernst von Roth was actually sort of anti-Nazi German who was at this consulate in Paris. And, why was he the one chosen, right? Was it an accident, or was it, she sort of suggests that maybe the Nazis actually encouraged Grinspan to kill that particular one because he was a problem for them. We don't know. The point is, and the fact that Eichmann never encountered anyone who questioned and said, why are you doing this? This is wrong. These are the kind of, the fact that you never hit that opposition, whereas when Nazis did hit that opposition, they often changed their views, or at least moderated their views, is part of the overarching morale of this story. And I think I think that's really an essential part of what she's doing, and so keeping in mind the many levels in which she's working is something that we all should be doing, and it's important. So thank you. Tim.
Hi, Roger. Thank you so much. The last 2 weeks have hovered around the idea of resistance and the idea of saying no. And I just love this theme, and you seem to really be attracted to it as well, as we keep returning to it. The King of Denmark and what happened in Bulgaria and Anton Schmidt. And I've been thinking about the word resistance because there's a lot of tension right now in the peace building community about how close to get the violence to resist. And we see it on the campuses right now. You know, we're on the edge of what is nonviolence, what is resistance. And I've been thinking about this whole of oblivion, you know, the one resistor that makes a difference, be it Anton Schmidt or the character played in the Spielberg film, whose name is I'm blanking out on. Of course, you know who it is, Schindler. The people who really resist, in my mind, and I'm wondering if there's something in Arendt that is congruous with this, is the idea that resistance is saying no, but not setting up a new enemy to defeat. I was wondering if you had some thoughts on that, and knowing Arendt as well as you do, if there's anything in this book or in the other ones we've covered so far that where she would say basically that saying no, the no that Eichmann never encountered, does not necessarily mean setting up a new enemy. And that resistance of that kind with an enemy would only replicate what it's trying to defeat or trying to dissolve.
Thank you, Tim. So yes, just to make clear, I think the theme of resistance is one of the core themes of her book. I think it's one of the core themes of all of her writing. You know, the in the preface to the Origins, she says that the effort here is to comprehend. Comprehension is the unpremeditated and attentive facing up to and resisting of reality, whatever it may be. Right? A line she repeats again in that book because it's so important to her. What does it mean to confront, face up to, and resist reality? And political action, right? Which courageous political action, courage is the first political virtue. Is absolutely core to what she's doing. You know, so this is a theme that's in a lot of her work. It's certainly heavily in her essay Civil Disobedience, amongst others. In this book, you know, we've highlighted a number of instances of it, and you've even rehearsed some of them, right? The King of Denmark, Bulgaria, you know, the fact that nobody ever confronted Eichmann. Now here, Abba Kovner and Herschel Greenspan. It will come up again in the epilogue, in the story of Shalom Schwarzbard, which Stephen mentioned and which I alluded to earlier, and I've written a fair bit about Shalom Schwarzbard. I published some papers on him. And I think you know, when we get to that story, Tim, we'll have a chance to delve into your question a little bit more. But as a prelude to it, you know, one of the questions is, to what extent is it justified to resist with violence outside the law? Right? I mean, to put it in less uppity language, to what extent is revenge justified?
Mhm.
And Arendt uses the Shalom Schwarzbard case to argue that revenge can be justified, but only if the avenger allows themselves to come back inside the law and be judged. And so we'll get to that when we read the Shalom Schwarzbard account in the epilogue. But it's a beautiful account, and I think one of the more interesting, exemplary accounts in a lot of her writing. So it's one I've spent a lot of time on and written a fair bit about. So we'll talk about it then.
Mhm.
But I hope that's helpful for now.
That helps a lot. Thank you, Roger.
Bruce.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add one additional point to the fascinating discussion we've had of storytelling and so on. I studied for a while with Walter Kaufman, and he would tell of his experiences at the end of the war. He was in an intelligence unit, and he was serving as a translator. And they went into some of the camps. I don't remember which ones he was involved with, but they started to interview the survivors that they were finding there immediately. And what Kaufman believed was that it was very, very important to get their stories or their information on the record. And they took transcripts, of course, and translated and had photographs and the like. Because this was an important, according to Kaufman, this was an important factor in pushing back against the Holocaust denial, which started already before the war was even completely over. And he thought that those early stories that from the survivors that they found, and then translating them and making sure that this was widely understood in the West, was a very important aspect of it. Of course, stories that people told later in remembrance of what they had gone through and so on, very important also. But I think that if they hadn't bothered to get the record down right away, the Holocaust denial movement might have been stronger than it was, and so on. At least that's what Professor Kaufman believed. Thanks.
Thank you. Is this Walter Kaufman, the translator?
Yes, Walter Kaufman, a philosophy professor at Princeton, translator.
I didn't know. I had no idea that he had this earlier career. That's fascinating. Thank you for letting me know that. I mean, I've obviously read his translations, which I don't particularly like, and his books for many years, but and obviously respect him greatly. I just didn't know that he had this history in the war. Fascinating. Your general point is right. But it brings up an interesting point of how you document or prove something, right? The Army did create these movies and documents about the camps, and they were shown widely after the camps were liberated. To what extent does the image prove, right? And there's been a lot of interesting writing about this. An ex-colleague of mine, Lawrence Douglas, used to write about this question of, does seeing make you believe? I mean, we're living through a time in which there are facts that we've all seen that large numbers of the people in this country deny, or at least claim to deny. And so, I think it is an interesting question of how you establish a factual record. And, one of the, I'll end with this. One of the things that, some of I'm trained as a lawyer, and, Arendt was not, but one of the things that I really enjoy about this book is her fidelity to sort of ideals of legal process and legal procedure. And one of the things that I find valuable about the law is that it's very easy to get on TV and, say things like the election was a fraud or this happened or didn't happen. But when you're in trial and there are consequences and you can go to jail for perjury and you can be cross-examined, things are different. And the law has a kind of, look, the law can be boring and the law can be slow, but if it works, it's supposed to, if not establish the truth, at least provide the different sides of a factual record such that someone can make their own decision. And that's the beauty of the law and the power of the law. I think one of the real questions of our present 2024 time is whether the ideal of legal process and legal impartiality will survive the next coming years as it's being politicized, admittedly on both sides, but probably more so by one side than the other. And I think that is one of the most important questions of our time. And I think one of the beauties of Arendt's book is that while she could understand that the trial was also more about more than Eichmann and about survivors and about the Holocaust and about all this other stuff, she wanted to insist that the trial remain a trial and be about justice and follow procedures. And she was upset that it didn't. And I understand why a lot of people want it to do other things. But I think that there is a danger in trying to have a legal trial do too many things. And I think Arendt fundamentally understood that. And that's where the kind of conservatism of her book comes from. The desire that it remain a book about law and justice and not about being a show trial or educating a next generation or providing a framework for people to speak and things like that. And so that's where I think that tension in her work comes from. So I'll end there. It's very exciting. We're not meeting next week. We're taking a 1 week off. And then we will meet in 2 weeks. And we're reading the last chapter of the book before the epilogue. The last chapter of the book is called Judgment, Appeal, and Execution. It's a very legal chapter, and I like that. And so we'll dig into the law. It's also a chapter in which we get to talk a little bit about human rights and genocide and crimes against humanity. So for those of you interested in these kind of questions, we'll dig in and hopefully get into some interesting discussions about them. She has very strong opinions about it. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thank all and enjoy your summer. And I'll see you next week or in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Paul.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Roger.
Sehr gute session.
Thanks,
Gracias.
everyone.
Gracias.
Gracias. Ciao, ciao. Wiedersehen. Ciao, ciao.